Et dans son viseur, au Grenoble, ils sont très forts, c'est sûr. Il va falloir surveiller le nucléaire. Une formation de 3 à 5. Comment je suis là pour je l'ai fait trop longtemps parce que je suis un peu enrhumée.
Est-ce que l'expérience est trop dur?
La semaine prochaine, là, on commence les choses. Il y a une mission demain.
Alors, c'est quoi?
Désolé, le code
Voilà, c'est ça.
T'as vu la poule? C'est bon. C'est bon. Ça va?
Comment tu les mets tout?
Je vais me rappeler.
J'ai dû avoir 7-8 ans en tant que
La bague de l'essai.
C'est pas
Tiens, qu'on peut lire.
Ça m'a choqué.
Ouais, c'est vrai.
Elle a dit, je crois que c'est long. Tu veux nous expliquer?
Et puis,
J'ai montré ma chaussette au prof.
Il a dit que vous laissez. Ah, bah Pierre et d'autres, j'aime pas ça.
Ouais, c'est comme ça. C'est comme ça que je les trouve.
C'est vrai qu'elle peut rentrer dans la
une présentation.
chaussette pour un stage. Je trouve que les gens. Mais du coup, tu fais ça et.
Oui, ça
Après, mais je vais me faire des chaussettes pour un stage. Génial, c'est vraiment bonne idée.
We're supposed to leave 30 minutes for questions, and I don't want to. What?
They don't really respect the 30 minutes mark.
Oh, really?
Ask the question.
Ok.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll trust the two of you to keep me kind of. Just give me an idea. Yeah, I'll get some water.
Vous allez mieux entendre.
Oh, you're graduate students? Are you graduate?
Si vous voulez vous avancer un peu avec vos chaises pour être plus proche, pour mieux entendre.
I want to be able to look at everyone.
Pas beaucoup, hein. Il y en a qui ont Avancez-vous un petit peu vers ici, on a de la place. « 60 minutes de concentration. Cours d'anglais gratuit pendant 60 minutes.
Is this your newsroom kind of? Yeah. Oh, it's nice.
Ils sont partis où les élèves après ton cours?
C'est de la salle, mais après j'ai rangé, donc je ne sais pas.
Vous avez des questions? Choc. Shall we go?
Sure. When are we ready?
Yes,
Okay, good.
you may start.
Did you give me a microphone?
It's on your. It's here.
Oh, it's here.
You're
Okay,
free.
can you hear me? Is it everyone can hear okay? All right. Well, we'll speak in English. And I've been told that's okay. What I'd like to do is, for about half the time, talk about journalism in Russia and the roots of the present crisis. Those topics are not identical, but they're related. There's a relationship there, which I'll try to explain. In the last half of the hour that we have, I hope you'll ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Now, first of all, about myself, I'm from Chicago. That's where I grew up. I went to the University of Chicago, and then I went to Oxford. And when I went back, I worked as a police reporter in Chicago. I went back to Oxford to defend my thesis, which of course I didn't finish while I was there. But unlike a lot of people, and unlike a lot of my classmates, I was determined to finish it. And I actually recommend this to all of you, because I took the view that at an early age, you have to get into the habit of finishing what you start. And I was afraid that if I didn't finish it, I would never finish anything ever. And I did finish it. And I've since finished a lot of things that took a lot of effort to finish. So that's a piece of worldly advice for all of you. But it paid off, because I went back to Oxford to defend my thesis. And I was working as a police reporter in Chicago. And in fact, I was covering really the grim side of life in Chicago, because working from midnight to 8. And my Oxford supervisor said, of course, this could only happen in a previous generation. I'm afraid now this would be out of the question. But he said, why don't you go and talk to my good friend who's the managing editor of the Financial Times? And I went to London, and he came in, and he said to me, he said, well, now where shall we send you? Send me? He doesn't even know me. He hasn't even hired me. Now he's talking about sending me somewhere. And he said, do you speak any foreign languages? I said, well, I speak Russian. This was a horrible exaggeration. What I meant was that I know more Russian than you do. And he said, fine, we'll send you to Moscow. And he said, be here in 6 weeks, and we'll take care of getting you a visa. So I said to him, I said, well, don't you want to see something I've written? And this kind of cloudy look came over his face, and he looked at me and he said, yes, send me something. And that was the end of it. And I went to Moscow for 6 years. And I also, he said, of course, you won't want a pension or anything like that. And I said, oh, I was 28 years old. I said, oh, no, hell no. I don't care about something like that. So I said, we'll hire you as a freelancer, which is what they did, and sent me to Moscow. He has since died, but I intend to take this up with him the first thing if I run into him in the next world about that pension that he told me I wouldn't need. But it opened up a great opportunity for a young person. Russia was far different then. And there was a colony, there were ghettos in effect for the foreign residents, who were almost exclusively journalists and diplomats. And they were surrounded by help, whether they wanted that help or not. Drivers, secretaries, maids, all of whom worked for the KGB. The guards at the entrance to these foreigners' apartment blocks, ostensibly placed there for the foreigners' protection, were assigned to keep out any suspicious Russian. That meant anybody who was not an official. So journalists were effectively isolated from Russian society, as were diplomats. Diplomats were isolated to a certain extent by the rules of their embassies, because the embassies were surrounded also by KGB informers, and exceptionally paranoid about having their diplomats compromised. That had the effect of limiting diplomats to all but a very few persons who were not official contacts. The difficulty was that many of the journalists, even though they actually had more freedom to go out into the society and meet people, followed the example of the diplomats. It was very easy in those years to become involved in diplomatic life. As soon as I arrived in Moscow, and remember, I was, 28 years old, former police reporter, no real international experience, and my Russian then was pretty rudimentary. It got better. However, the other journalists and diplomats probably spoke less Russian than I did in those years. But nonetheless, no sooner did I arrive than I began to be inundated with invitations to dinners, cocktail parties, all kinds of social events, openings, all of them involving foreigners. All of them had certain selected Russians there, who I later learned were in fact checked and vetted by the KGB for reliability, and who could be counted on to repeat communist propaganda. And it was very easy to make that diplomatic world your world, because in your office, you were given a TASS newswire that was translated into English. You had a secretary who spoke English. You had to hire her. This was a condition, and your newspaper paid for it. And she translated the Russian press. Your interviews were set up again by your secretary and again with English-speaking Russian officials. And it was no surprise that the number one destination for Western correspondents who were supposedly seeking information about Russia was a place called the Institute of the USA in Canada. Why should we go to the Institute of the USA in Canada in order to learn about the Soviet Union? But the reality was that that was the institute that was completely staffed by KGB disinformation specialists and KGB analysts who were anxious, first of all, to disinform the Western journalists, and second of all, to learn what they could from them about Western attitudes. So during the time I was there, that world absorbed the energy and the attention of most of the foreign journalists. At the same time, many of the journalists were older and married, and in those days they were usually men. And the shopping in the Soviet Union was something out of this world. I mean, you had to stand in long lines, and for exceptionally low quality products. If you got high quality products, you got them because you had an arrangement with the saleswoman. In exchange for some service, she would hold back, for example, a decent piece of meat or some such thing. Well, foreigners, of course, were not privy to that system. But what was provided for us was a network of so-called Berioska hard currency stores. And those stores offered goods far beyond anything that was available to the average Soviet citizen. And at the same time, there were catalogs where people would make huge orders, for example, to the Stockman's department store in Helsinki. And so oftentimes, the wives of Western correspondents were extremely unhappy, made sure that their husbands got out of there as quickly as possible, so there was no time to get any real expertise. And the turnover was very rapid. Now, the one exception to all this were the dissidents, the democratic dissidents who held press conferences, including Andrei Sakharov, who was the nuclear physicist who was the dissident leader. But here too there was a problem with superficiality. And that is that the dissidents would risk imprisonment to hold press conferences and invite Western correspondents. They got the names and numbers of the Western correspondents. They called around to them, and not all Western correspondents even went to those press conferences because they feared that that would put them in a bad relationship with the authorities. And the authorities would reward compliant correspondence by arranging interviews with high-ranking officials, which they depicted as exclusive interviews. Now, the organization that was the most inclined to make this kind of deal with the authorities, in other words, no coverage of dissidents in return for a high-level interview with a Soviet official at which he repeats Soviet propaganda, was Time magazine. They, every 2 years, they got an interview with Brezhnev. The interview lasted for a half an hour. Brezhnev repeated the contents of Pravda. Leonid Brezhnev, in case you don't remember, was the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the head of the Soviet Union. In any case, but they would write stories saying, well, he wore this kind of suit, his cufflinks were gold cufflinks, he had a nice tie. That passed for news, and in response and in exchange for that, they would avoid dissident press conferences. But even those who went to the dissident press conferences had a problem, because the dissidents they provided information about abuses of human rights in a country that the journalists didn't really know. And so some reporters, especially those who were covering the Jewish emigration movement, would report on the details that were provided, but they would almost never follow up. For example, there would be a story that so-and-so was arrested in connection with an attempted strike at the Putilovsky tractor factory in Leningrad. And so, okay, we put that, they would report that. But a strike at the Putilovsky factory in Leningrad, well, it was one of the main factories in the Russian Revolution. You have to go out there and find people who were there, who understood what had happened, and to tell the whole story. So this seemed to me to be crazy. And what I started to do was I would go to the dissident press conferences, and first thing I did was I said, no more KGB assistants. And it turned out that, in fact, people had hired these secretaries, drivers, and so on from the official organization, UPEDIKA it was called, that was run by the KGB, but were not compelled to. But it was such an ingrained habit that everybody did it. I said, that's it. I'm hiring only Americans. And so I became, I was the Financial Times correspondent. I was my office. Every time they would call around to the correspondents, they would talk to a Russian secretary, oftentimes very pleasant people, but who were working for the KGB. When they called my office, they talked to an American who spoke Russian. I found them. It was not easy, but there was a woman named Deborah Seward who later became an AP correspondent. She was a nanny. Her Russian wasn't great at first, but it was good enough. And I found a Peruvian guy who was married to a Russian woman. And so, but I wanted them to work for me and not for the KGB. Anyway, I began collecting the stories from people's lives. And those stories eventually went into the first book I wrote, which I worked on it for a long time here in Paris. It's called Age of Delirium, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Union. And it was based on the real experiences of people. Well, this led to an attempt to expel me in 1979. And and this was also very interesting because when the Financial Times asked for a visa, there was something about me that the Russians or the Soviets didn't like. Nothing personal, I mean, but just the idea that unmarried, relatively young, going there as a freelancer instead of like a serious person. It all smacked a little bit of independence. So they gave a temporary visa. And the FT unwisely did not insist on a permanent visa. Temporary visa you have to renew every year. It's merely a technicality. But in 1979, they said they're not renewing it. And they assumed that since I was an American working for a British publication, in those days that was also a rarity, that neither the British nor the Americans would defend me. But they miscalculated. Both the British and the Americans defended me. They both said they would expel Soviet correspondents in exchange for my expulsion. They would treat the cancellation of my visa as an expulsion. And then the French government got into the act, and they said that this is a violation of the Helsinki Agreements. And the Helsinki Agreements specifically provided in 1975 for the free flow of information, in return for which we said that they could continue to occupy Eastern Europe and other things. This is the kind of trades we make. I once, and this Helsinki Agreement, this is a kind of a little bit of a diversion, but every time I left the Soviet Union, I used the opportunity to read books about Soviet history and what was going on, particularly the Gulag, the purges, the repressions, and so on. But I bought the books. I wanted them with me in Moscow, and I had a hell of a time getting them through customs back into the country. So every time they would confiscate my books, I was getting furious because, first of all, I didn't like to constantly buy new ones. But I didn't like them. I wanted them. I needed them for my work. One time I came to the border, and I decided to have a kind of dialogue with the border guard. And he said, "Listen, we're holding your books." I said, "You're confiscating my books. You're not holding them." He says, "No, we're just holding your books. You can get them back when you go out." He says, "I know you're not going to give them back to me." And I said, "Listen, I want to make a deal with you. You can take my books, but I want you to admit that the Soviet Union violates the Helsinki Agreement." So suddenly it was becoming interesting for him. He has this dull job, confiscating people's belongings. Suddenly somebody is actually talking to him. And he said that, well, this Soviet Union observes all its agreements. I said, except the Helsinki Agreements. He said, especially the Helsinki Agreements. So, but he didn't give me the books back. So anyway, so that was the story of being a journalist in the Soviet Union. There are also lessons there, because regimes of all kinds try to manipulate journalists. The kind of manipulation and mind control that existed in the Soviet Union was in some ways unique, but there are aspects of it that we can see in other authoritarian societies, and the attempt of sources to make journalists dependent and to make them engage in unethical trades is not a new phenomenon. After and is not restricted to a totalitarian regime. But the lesson that I took away from it is journalists have more freedom than they think to force sources and governments to respect their obligations. And after all, their obligation is an obligation to the people to provide. I mean, we don't speak for ourselves. I mean, we speak for society, and it's right to know, and it's right to have truthful information and not be manipulated. They don't care about manipulating us. They're manipulating through us a society. In the post-Soviet Russia was different. I mean, there was none of this. After the Soviet Union fell, there was none of this kind of elaborate mechanism, but there was fear because for the most part, foreign journalists were not touched. That was hardly the case for true of Russian journalists. I can't tell you. I have there a list of people in my mind of those who were murdered in post-Soviet Russia. You've heard some of the names: Anna Politkovskaya, Yuri Shekhatchikhin, Sergei Yushchenko. These are all Sergei Yushchenkov. These were, well, Boris Nemtsov. These were all my personal friends. Well, under those circumstances, journalists didn't probe too deeply into a lot of the most important stories. You know, the contract killings. It just didn't pay to become too curious. The single most important story was the bombing of the buildings in 1999 that brought Putin to power. And if you're interested, I've written extensively about this, and you can find, you know, detailed explanation. I won't go into it now, on Amazon in my books, if you are interested. The most recent is called "The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep: Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship under Yeltsin and Putin." The shooting down of the Malaysian airliner, you may have seen the story on Reuters yesterday, that the Dutch investigators, I think these have got to be the most witless investigators who ever lived, now think that Putin may have ordered the transfer of the anti-aircraft missiles that brought down Malaysian airliner MH17 in 2014. Well, I mean, that was obvious in 2014. It was obvious in 2017 when I said that Russia needs to be held accountable for mass murder. And it's obvious today, and it's obvious not only that and this was a job for journalists, and not only did he order the missiles, but that a Russian crew transported them and shot down deliberately the Malaysian airliner, killing 300 people, including almost 100 children. All it required was a little bit of initiative on the part of journalists. That basically, surprisingly, with all these crimes, the facts were actually on the surface. But the one pattern repeated itself again and again. The Russian government would give an absurd explanation. The Western journalists would repeat the absurd explanation, and the subject was closed. It was only because of the investigation independently instigated by the widow of Alexander Litvinenko into his nuclear poisoning in London in 2006 that some kind of Western investigative body came up with a conclusion that the Russians were responsible for a crime. And I'm talking about the poisoning with polonium of Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB and KGB officer. I'm sure you're familiar with the case, or at least many of you are. In that case, if in the Soviet Union it was a case of people simply succumbing to conformism, in the case of post-Soviet Russia, it was reacting to fear and false hopes that maybe this boogeyman will go away, or he won't be as dangerous as we think he is, and that way guaranteeing that he would become even more dangerous. Now, the final thing I want to talk about, and then I want to get your questions as the hope of the future in journalism, which I know you all are, is why we are at war. And it's interesting, on the subject of accepting absurd explanations, uh, you're probably aware that in 1999, four buildings were blown up. People were murdered in the middle, were killed in the middle of the night as they slept. There was a fifth bomb in a building in the city of Ryazan, southeast of Moscow. Miraculously, that bomb was discovered. Had it not been, 400 more people would have been killed. Not only, actually 800, because the building was on a hill. And if it had blown up, it would have hit the neighboring building with the force of an avalanche and taken that one too. That would have been 800 additional dead, though they were spared. But they killed enough people in order to justify a new war in Chechnya and elevate Putin to the presidency. We had time in the United States, and I know this because I've got documents through the Freedom of Information Act, which is a very valuable tool for journalists, that show the U.S. Embassy was warned repeatedly that the Ryazan incident was a genuine attempt to blow up a building. The Russian head of the FSB said that this was a training exercise. But what could be more absurd than to hold a training exercise and test people for vigilance in a country that was being flooded with false reports of bomb sightings in the wake of 4 successful bombings of civilian buildings? And in fact, the persons who planted that bomb were arrested, and they turned out to be not Chechen terrorists. They turned out to be FSB agents, and they presented identification. So as a result of not saying, the United States made a decision not to raise this issue. And they made a whole series of other decisions not to raise, the murders of Anna Politkovskaya, Russia's premier investigative journalist, Alexander Litvinenko, who wrote about the apartment bombings, and many others. In every case, the Russian authorities would give an idiotic explanation, and we would repeat that explanation. The killing of Alexander Litvinenko and Anna Politkovskaya was followed by the so-called reset policy. And the person who became the advisor to President Obama on Russian affairs just before he took office, Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015, and I had a talk with him and explained to him that Putin is dangerous and needs to be deterred. But in every case, he then went on to announce this policy. Of course, they got the name in Russian wrong because they can't even do that right. But and they finally, Putin was enabled and emboldened to launch the war that exists now, a war that could have easily been prevented. So I think, just to finish up the message for you as you embark on your careers, from me, who's already had one, sort of, is don't be satisfied with official explanations. Don't allow yourself to be manipulated, and try to go beyond what people are saying and look and go to the next layer and the next layer beyond that, to gather information that can provide the context to really understand something. So much of the dialogue is superficial. Well, you want to try to be an exception to that because you have access to the means of mass communication. And I know you're going to use it fruitfully and effectively. So now, with that, maybe I can answer your questions if you have any.
I have a question about the foreign reporters that are in Russia now. Do you think it's possible for them to produce quality information, or do you think maybe they're collecting information and then they'll communicate it later? Because I I struggle to understand how they can all stay there given the war and still do their work.
Well, this is wartime, and they've closed. The Russians have closed all independent publications, and they've driven out. Those who are operating, the foreign correspondents, are operating in a legal situation in which they themselves can be expelled or arrested. So I think their presence in Moscow is pretty symbolic. I mean, the most important information is coming out from the Russian media that is now abroad, but that nonetheless has connections, and on Telegram. Yeah.
Now that it's a war, pretty much all foreign correspondents have been expelled from Russia. Do you expect that if the war ends at some point, Russia will again accept foreign journalists, or will they use it as a pretext to no more have foreign journalists in their territory?
It depends. By the way, I'm going to be speaking on the subject of the future of Russia tonight at INALCO. And if you, at 7 p.m., I'll speak in Russian, but there'll be a French translation. If you'd like to come, I'll be discussing this and other related issues. You can find it on my Facebook or Twitter feed, the announcement. But in any case, to get back to the question, everything will depend on what kind of country Russia becomes. Russia could revert to mass terror. If the regime feels that that's the only way they can survive, we've got the example of Saddam Hussein after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. Kuwait was liberated, and there was an uprising in Iraq itself, which was put down with massive bloodshed. On the other hand, the proponents of war in Russia may prove, depending on the outcome, may be discredited, and Russia under those conditions will have a deep interest in rejoining the civilized world, or joining it for the first time, you could say, in which case, of course, they will want foreign correspondents back. It's very, very, the question of the future of journalism in Russia is really intimately connected with the question of the future of the country.
And do you think this transition of Russia to civilization can happen if Putin stays in power, or Putin has to go?
He'll of course have to be. He would be removed, and there would have to be a new regime.
Okay.
He is but Putin is a product of an entire attitude in Russia toward the individual, entire disrespect for human life, and only if that attitude changes can there be a basis for a better future for Russia. Did you want to?
Yeah, I had a question. What do you think about the French president statement about the importance of not humiliating Vladimir Putin? He said that, I think it was in April.
I know, he's made that statement a number of times, and he's not the only one.
What do you think of that logic?
Well, I think that let Putin worry about not humiliating himself. We should if he had been so worried about humiliation, he wouldn't have embarked on this. That's not our worry. It's interesting also to bear in mind that someone who is so callous and disrespectful in relationship to the lives of others, I'm talking now about the lives of Russians who are being thrown into a meat grinder, into an inferno. These are young idiots who are taken from rural areas, and you have no real understanding of why they're fighting, what they're fighting, and they're dying in the tens of thousands. Well, someone like that will have a hypertrophied regard for his own life, and the key is to make it clear to him that the best way to preserve his own life is to put an end to this. I wouldn't even begin to think in terms of whether he's humiliated or not. I would think in terms of whether he understands what's going to happen to him if this war isn't brought to an end, and that will be effective. Not concern about, his pride, such as it is. Yes.
So I was interested, since you really lived in the Soviet Union and you sort of experienced the whole communist system as well as a foreign correspondent, because today, so we have for example, the recent closure of the Sakharov Center and Memorial, so organizations like that, and I mean, they even wanted to rename Volgograd to Stalingrad. If you think that there's this sort of idealization of the Soviet Union that's sort of coming back?
Memorial, it's in particular, Memorial was an organization dedicated to the commemoration of those who were murdered by the regime, murdered or imprisoned unjustly. So the basic idea behind Memorial, and I had a lot of contact with them, was that the individual is not just raw material, but that every individual life has value. Well, that's completely incompatible with the message that's going out now. And that's a message which is intended to serve the hold on power of a tiny group of completely degraded and amoral individuals. So, if the reason that they tolerated Memorial in the past was because it was to their advantage not to signal to the West their true identity, and Memorial, an independent press that was nonetheless controlled, but could publish and investigate. All those things helped to give the West the impression that the Putin regime was not as dangerous as it really was. But there's no use, that doesn't serve any purpose now. And on the contrary, it's destabilizing to have people raise this kind of issue, the idea of the value of human life under conditions in which people are being thrown by the thousands into an inferno. And by the way, when I was expelled from Russia in 2013, it came just as the Maidan revolt in Ukraine had broken out in Kyiv. And that example of a self-organizing, democratic, voluntary people's revolt involving hundreds of thousands of people protesting against kleptocratic rule, of course, changed their calculus. And one of the first reactions, what the Russians call, I know we have some Russian speakers, первая ласточка, first sparrow, was my expulsion, because I think that they had obviously been wanting to get rid of me for a long time. They used to brag that no American journalist had been expelled from Russia since the end of the Cold War. And they pointed to me as an example of how tolerant they were. But their tolerance didn't last. But in any case, we're going to see an increase in Soviet symbolism, Stalingrad, Soviet Union, but that's the least of our problems right now. I mean, this is a military confrontation. And I'm sad to say that given the hold over the psychology of people and the hold over state television in Russia, it's going to take real hardship and a decisive defeat to force people once again to think. And we have historical examples. After the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, Russia got its first constitution. And it was defeat in Afghanistan, which was an important factor in the decision to liberalize that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Anyone else have any questions? Someone in the back, I see. Hi.
What connections do you see between the Russia where you started reporting, like under the Soviet Union, and then Russia when it was maybe liberalization, and then Russia today? I mean, I know you don't have a direct insight, but still, what connections do you see or continuities?
Well, everything was turned upside down, that's for sure. In the Soviet Union, the ideology was everything. By the ideology, I mean Marxism, Leninism. Then everything that had been considered sacred was denounced, and the system changed. Superficially, it changed. But the attitude of people toward the state and the state's attitude toward the individual remained the same. The idea that you can do anything with a person. I mean, just to give you an example, during the 1990s, the period of great reforms, so-called great reforms, the number of surplus deaths in Russia was 6 million. Now, surplus mortality or surplus deaths is a demographer's term used to describe the number of deaths that occur in a given population that could not have been predicted on the basis of pre-existing trends. For Russia, that figure in the 1990s was 6 million. When demographers saw the death rate in Russia during the period of quote-unquote reform, and they saw the vertical rise in the death rate, basically they couldn't believe the figures. No country had ever shown a death rate like that under war, and anything other than conditions of war. And that's because the reform process was so barbarous. It drove people into such grinding poverty, deprived them of hope, because once the old ideals had been discredited, there were no new ideals. And instead of commissars, the country was taken over by criminals. So for real change in Russia, it's not a matter of changing the social system, the economic system. It's a question of changing the morality of the country and establishing the rule of law for the first time, and the idea that people can be treated equally and can be treated as having value. And that did not happen, definitely. And despite the fact that the West, lionized the Russian reformers, and the U.S. was in the lead on this, it showed again, the bane of Western countries, which is our superficiality and naivete in dealing with dangerous adversaries. Anyone else have any?
I know it can be hard to answer because we have no really information about that, but what do you think the population think in Russia? What do you think they have in mind about the war? And do you think they can play a role in the maybe end of the war? What do you think of the role of the population in Russia?
This is the big question. From all the people I talk to, I'm in touch with people in Russia all the time, and people who are coming and going. Well, superficially, support for the war is still strong. But there's the one thing people do say is that Putin's popularity has declined, in part not because of the fact that people are angry about an unjust war, but that the war is being prosecuted so badly. But that can change. Economists tell me that the effect of sanctions is going to be felt. Is going to be felt. A Russian plane caught on fire in Thailand. They're not getting Western components. The losses are beginning to be felt, and once they mobilize people from Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg. The war losses will be felt in those cities as well, and that's what counts. Russia's a very, very unpredictable country. Bismarck said there are two things we can never know: what the weather will be tomorrow and what is going to happen in Russia. And it's still true. People oftentimes say that Russia is a very inert country, and that nothing changes there. This is both true and false. I mean, inert politically, because no one, everyone is submissive. But a country in which millions of people are submissive, in which there's no real civil society, is actually extremely unstable, because it can be turned upside down by a very small organized group in the center, in the capital, and the rest of the country won't know about it or participate until they're informed. That's what happened with the Russian Revolution, by the way. That's what happened in 1991. The events that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union took place within a single square mile in the center of Moscow. People in the Moscow suburbs were unaware or uninvolved in what was taking place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a question about the attitude of the West during like the 2000 decades. Why do you think the West and especially Americans were so soft with Putin during those years, like 2000 and on?
Superficiality, wishful thinking, careerism, and don't. Unfortunately, I know all these people, so which makes it even more discouraging. Partially because take this guy who I won't name, but if you follow Russian events, you know who it is. Who Boris Nemtsov and I tried to enlighten. The thing is that Obama came into office in the U.S. in 2008 with the idea that all the problems in the world were the fault of George W. Bush. And so he announced the so-called reset policy, because once they reset the policy, in other words, we do things differently than Bush had done them, then Putin will, of course, be impressed and we'll all be friends. This policy was described as at that point, in 2008, Dmitry Medvedev became the president of Russia. Now, Medvedev was basically a stooge for Putin, because the Constitution said you could only have 2 consecutive terms, and then they changed the Constitution. That was the only thing that Medvedev succeeded in doing. But he made a few liberal remarks, and Obama's entire foreign policy was based on a tilt toward Medvedev. We're going to bet on Medvedev. And now, as some of you may or may not know, Medvedev is the most bloodthirsty of the propagandists in the Russian media. But he was never, but that's not surprising. He was never anything. He was just whatever he was told to be. Now he's told to be, now he's told to threaten nuclear war. Before, he was told to socialize with the Americans. And Obama took him to a famous hamburger restaurant in Arlington, where they have Arlington, Virginia, if you know the Washington, D.C. area, where they have these enormous hamburgers. We're really kind of hopeless in some respects. And our journalists oftentimes don't want to take an independent stance and use the exposure that they have. Because after all, a journalist in Moscow sees a reality that the people in Washington and London and Paris do not see. But too often they're inclined to go along with this groupthink as well. And then we get enlightened, but we get enlightened when it's fortunately it's not too late for us. It's too late for the Ukrainians. It's too late for and the Russians who are victims of this slaughter. And remember, we're now going into the hundreds of thousands of people killed if we take the tally on both sides. So to get back to the whole question of journalism, your responsibility is actually very heavy. And it's and I'm hoping you'll do better. Your generation will do better than mine did, because that's very much needed in an age of new challenges and new technology and new types of aggressivity. Is there anybody else who has a question? Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask what you think of if you follow the sort of whole situation with Yevgeny Prigozhin, and especially since he has the Wagner Group, and since that's a sort of has become very powerful, especially in the war right now, and if you think that he could be if there could be an internal power struggle between him and Putin. Because he has, in recent times, he has sort of styled himself potentially as an alternative to Putin. So if you think that that could be a threat to him?
We don't know all the details of the internal situation in Russia, but I doubt it. I mean, Prigozhin is a creature of Putin's. I mean, the whole Wagner military group was formed under Putin, under general foreign policy guidance to give them an instrument for intervening overseas. I wouldn't have thought so, tell you the honest truth. But what I do think is that there are bound to be people in the military and in the security services who understand that this is a disaster for Russia, that people are being killed in incredible numbers and that it has to stop. Whether they'll have the means to seize power or to put an end to it, that's another question. Yeah. I think we have yeah.
You spoke about your deal with a bodyguard. Yes.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
You spoke about your deal with.
What's this?
You spoke your deal with the bodyguard in Russia about your books. What were your relations with the secret services in Russia?
My relation with the what?
With the secret services?
Well, they were everywhere, you know. They listened to the phones. The foreigners' buildings were like a recording studio, and I even met after the fall of the Soviet Union. I met the KGB officers who were responsible for keeping me under surveillance. Actually, once they were very friendly, and we became great friends. But they told me what they knew, and I told them what I had managed to conceal. So it was. But they were, the foreigners' cars had special license plates, so that it was no secret where they were going and who they were seeing. We didn't have cell phones in those days, but so but you could call if you wanted to be safe from wiretapping, you had to use one of the public phones, a little 2-kopeck piece, which went into a tin box, and sometimes gave you a line and sometimes didn't. But the most effective thing, of course, were the informers. you could never be 100% sure whether even people you trusted, and relations were built on trust, but they tried to insinuate people, and they often succeeded, and there were there were a lot of social situations that they would find out about, social groups, people who would meet, kind of friends, especially around well-known artists. They would try to make sure that at least one person was informing. So it was not, it was nearly total surveillance. On the other hand, the question is, the point was to avoid anything for which you could be blackmailed. And the different people were more or less vulnerable to blackmail, depending on their situation. A married person who had an affair with a Russian, for example, could be blackmailed. And there were cases like that. There was a famous case involving the French ambassador some years ago. But on the other hand, there are certain things they couldn't do. Even with surveillance, if you were doing your job and you were acting within the rules as they had been established, they could either throw you out or leave you in place, but they couldn't blackmail you. Yeah. Is that it? Is that it for us? Well, okay, everyone. I wish you all good luck in your careers. Do great things. I know you will. If you're free tonight, come to INALCO, 7th auditorium, but you have to register online at the site of Russie Liberté. I'll be glad to see you again. Anyway, good to see you. All right. All right. There we go. Okay.
Can we record with you in the studio if you want
Yes.
questions?